There's honestly like a million of these walking home horror stories. It looked like everyone had a really hard time in their childhood. So without further ado, let's grab a blanket, turn off your lights for true scary horror stories that happened after school when you're just trying to get home and get some pizza.
The Creeper at the Kindergarten. So, this story takes place in 2001 to 2002 or so, back when I was 7 to 8 years old. I was walking home with my best friend after playing some basketball at my school when we met an odd man, who I believe was in his late 40s or so at the time. Neither of us thought much of it as we were walking past him, but out of the blue, he called for us to come help him with something. We had already passed him, and were maybe 10 to 15 meters away from him for some odd reason. The old don't talk to strangers rule did not apply in my head, and I slowly started walking towards him and asking him what's the matter. He had apparently been walking around in the forest on the left side of the footpath. The kindergarten is on the right, and had been stung by a lot of thorn bushes and every small evil he could come up with, and that he thought we would believe. As mentioned above, he asked us to help him with something. He wanted us to pluck the thorns off of his body, more specifically in his private area. As I was approaching him, he started grabbing around in his left pocket, and there it was, his genitals on display, though not nakedly, with his inside pocket covering it. He was holding out a banknote, trying to lure us in. Luckily, I realized what was happening, and fortunately, I wasn't all that close to him, and I started backing up the hill again and told my friend to run. Some years later, there was this case on the TV, the Pocket Man. He had apparently been sexually assaulting children since the mid-70s. He looked so familiar. And even to this day, I feel I'm pretty sure that it was the same guy that my friend and I met 5 years previous. Walking home from school. When I was in primary school, from about grade 5 onwards, ages 10 to 12, my mother allowed me to start walking home from school by myself rather than go to an after-school care program until she picked me up on her way home from work. Anyways, the walk took between 30 to 40 minutes, depending on how much I stuffed around at the 7-Eleven on the way. I was happy doing this, as it gave me a sort of first go at independence. One day, I had just left school and was at the top of the street my school is in, passing the very last house before the coffee roasting shop in High Street. There was an Asian man sitting on the wide brick, rendered fence of this property. Okay, I thought, happened a lot in that neighborhood. This guy says, hello. He asked me some other questions which I cannot recall, but it made me stop. I answered his questions immediately, followed by others I don't recall. I did, however, remember this one. Come and sit here. Pats fence next to him. No. Again. Sit. Pats and slaps the fence vigorously. No, I need to get home. My mom is waiting for me. Which was somewhat of a lie. She was still at work, but I had to call her the instant I was in the door, so she knew I was safe. There were no mobile phones then. They came along 5 years later. I wasn't an academic achiever in school, but I knew when something wasn't right. Again and again, patting the fence. Sit down here. No, I'm going home now. It's important to know that the entire time I was about 5 to 6 feet away from him, so no attempts at grabbing could be made, despite the fact that it was 3:30 in the afternoon with people everywhere. I purposefully walked wider than I had to pass them, and continued home. I told Mom when she got home, and she was very happy with my actions. I'd seen this guy before in his garden, around his house and whatnot, so I knew he wasn't some random. I sometimes wonder what plans he had. Whether he would have eventually coerced a seemingly naive schoolboy into his house and then who knows what. He had obviously seen me around the same time every day. Luckily, Mom had told me when I was very little, don't accept lollies from strangers, and of course, she explained the dynamic of how free lollies and talking to strangers leads to child abduction, etc. And I never forget that. Ballerina's father. It was a shining spring day. I was walking back home from school as every other day. There was an about 20 minutes walking distance from school. Most of the time, I was walking with two other classmates who were living closer to school than me. So, I always had to walk like 7 minutes alone. After my second classmate got home, I was 9 or 10 years old, shorter and more chubby than the other girls. On this particular day, after my classmate got home, I took my path to home as usual. I noticed a man was following me somehow. I don't remember exactly if I saw him before me and my classmate split, or I just noticed him just then. He wasn't old, like maybe late 20s, maybe early 30s, wearing casual but nice clothes. He was even handsome, I could say. Anyways, nothing weird at first sight. I just continued to walk home. After all, I was living in a big city. There are good chances that someone can take the same streets as me for a few minutes. He got closer and closer to me, until he was right next to me when he said, "Hi," smiling very warmly. Well, I expected that probably he's searching for a street and got lost. "You are very cute, you know?" I have to admit that hearing such a compliment can be quite overwhelming, but in the next second, I start to think something is not actually right. I mean, strangers don't just stop you in the middle of the street to tell you you're cute. My parents used to work in a huge factory, and had lots of friends and coworkers whom I didn't always recognize, but they seemed to recognize me. But this was not the case, since he did not introduce himself as a friend of my parents. "I have a daughter about your age. She is a ballerina." Now, this sounded more strange, and it actually made me feel uncomfortable. First, because this guy just looked too young to have a daughter my age. Second, because ballet is not something very popular in my city, especially not in the 2000s. And it sounded like just the line that would make any girl of my age very enthusiastic, right? I started to think how to get rid of this situation and just go home, since I was very close already. "Would you like to come to my house to meet my daughter? I'm sure you would make good friends." Of course, I didn't want to. And now my parents' advice, don't talk to strangers, don't go anywhere with strangers, started to shout in my head. I had to refuse, but I tried to do it in a polite way. I'm sorry, but I can't. My father is waiting for me at home and I can't be late," which was partly a lie. My father wasn't at home. Actually, nobody was at my home at the time. "Where do you live?" Shit, this creepy guy wants to know where I live? And I'm gonna be home alone for the next 3 to 4 hours. That's bad. On the street. We were already at the corner of my street. Luckily, I was living in a house at the very end of the street, and there were some apartment buildings too, so it wouldn't have been possible to just spot my address. I already start to make a backup plan that in case he will keep following me, I won't go home, but at my neighbor's house, who were always at home, at least until this dude won't be near anymore. "Are you sure you don't want to come?" "Yes, I am sure." "Okay, bye." and he took off on the other direction. I kept looking if he is now somehow following me, but he didn't, and I rushed home. So, weird ballerina's father whatsoever. Let's not meet again. The man on the bike. I wish I could find the news report for this, but alas, it's been 11 years, and I can't remember enough details to locate anything. As a young child and young teen, my parents really instilled in me the concept of stranger danger and the buddy system and trusting my instincts. I went to a private Catholic school until I was in 7th grade, and despite the fact that I lived mere blocks from the school, I can't think of a single occasion when I would walk home without an adult chaperone. Most days I was picked up and driven home by another family from the school. Don't get me wrong, we lived in a very safe neighborhood. Most of my neighbors were either elderly and had lived in the same area since their houses were built in the 50s and 60s, or were quiet, academic-minded Silicon Valley business families who'd spent millions of dollars to buy a modest older home just so they could send their children to one of the district's California Distinguished Schools, a public school in the top 5% for test scores in the state. In 7th grade, around the year 2002, I transferred to the nearest public middle school, and at the same time, my best friend moved to the area and started attending the same school, using my address. Since her family lived on the other side of town, we'd walk home together daily, and she'd spent afternoons at my house with me. She wasn't quite as anxious as I was, and I'd been walking alone for several years, so I basically considered her the street-smart friend. It took a lot of convincing to get my parents to even allow me to start walking without an adult, even though the public school was only slightly farther than my old school. Anyways, everything was fine for the first several months. Many of the students from the school took the same routes home, so it was rarely just my friend and me. We'd often be in large crowds of middle schoolers. Then, towards the middle of the school year, we decided to join the after-school drama club. While most of the school was walking home at 2:20, Drama Club kept its very small group of 10 to 15 students after school twice a week until 3:30. And then the streets would be quiet, and it would often just be me and my friend walking. On one particular rainy afternoon, my friend suggested we cut through an area of the neighborhood to get home and out of the rain faster. As we were walking, I saw a man biking towards us in a yellow poncho, holding a tall can of beer. I immediately felt uneasy and asked my friend to just take the long route with me, but she refused, so we kept going her way. The man rode past us and said hello, but nothing else. A few days later, for some reason or another, I was walking home alone. Maybe my friend was sick that day. I decided to stay close to all the schools because I felt like it would be the safest, even though the route was longer. As I came to the corner of a street a block away from my house, right across from the elementary school, I noticed a man standing behind a tree in a yard in front of a vacant home for rent. I immediately crossed the street and, being the anxious child that I was, pulled out my for emergency use only cell phone and plugged 911 in, ready to call if I needed to. The man walked out from behind the tree with his hands covering his face so I could only see his eyes, and while he never left the yard, I could feel him staring at me the entire way home. The next day, over the intercom at school, an announcement was made. Students had begun reporting seeing a suspicious male on a bike. Description similar to the man that I had seen in the area. He tried to talk to several people and made a lot of people uneasy, School officials strongly suggested walking home in a group. I distinctly remember feeling my stomach in my throat as soon as I heard that. About a week went by, and we didn't see the man again. My nerves were finally starting to calm down. My friend was back and walking with me daily, and I felt safe. I never told her about the experience I had seeing the man in the yard of the vacant house, because I was afraid she'd brush me off as being overly cautious and dramatic. But for some reason this particular day, I decided to start telling her about it. As soon as we got close enough to the house for me to point it out, I see a man on a bike, in a poncho, no rain this particular day, carrying a tall can of beer and riding towards us. My friend also saw him and immediately told me to calm down. We were across the street from the elementary school, so we were perfectly safe. I kept walking, trying not to look at him, when he stopped, next to us. "Hey ladies, I was wondering if you've seen a kin around here. I lost my kin over by the creek, and I'm really worried about him. I think he crawled under the fence. Can you help me find him?" The creek he was referring to was a small, fully fenced alley containing about 1/4 inches of water in a ditch, right across the street from my house. I instantly noped, but I couldn't find my actual voice, so my friend told him we hadn't seen a kin and pushed me to keep walking. In a panic, as soon as he rode away, I stopped her and told her we needed to walk back to the elementary school office and call the police. She thought I was being dramatic, of course, but walked me over there and then left. I could see the man on the bike ride to the opposite end of the street and enter a house. Shortly before the police arrived, I was standing outside pointing to the house, out to the lady from the school office. As we were talking, the man from the bike and another man exited the house, got into a vehicle and sped away. I reported this to the police, and that was the last I heard for about another week. Shortly later, the house I saw the man leaving was raided. It was supposed to be vacant, but evidence of a meth lab was found. They suspected the man on the bike was involved, but they hadn't yet located him. About 2 or 3 months go by, with no sighting of the man. And suddenly, another announcement at the school. The man on the bike was arrested for attempting to abduct a high school student a block away from the middle school.